I am happy to report that I have recently come to the conclusion that I was wrong about something in John Stuart Mill, something I've addressed on a few occasions on this channel. I'll probably leave the relevant videos up here. Might make things clearer. You know, much as the myths about philosophy that I consider in the Philosophy Myths playlist are indeed myths. They're errors, but they can help to clarify the truth. So I hope will be the case here. I have made an error in my interpretation of Mill. Mill is, I think, making a lot of sense in some passage where I thought him to be making some mistake and thinking something that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's first of all summarize what mistake I thought Mill was making, and then introduce a passage in Mill's Utilitarianism where I was getting my interpretation of Mill on the subject from, and then we'll look at this other book by Mill and introduce an alternative interpretation according to which the mistake I attributed to Mill is a mistake he does not make. Okay, so what is actually valuable? One utilitarian perspective, which I believe I could find in an old email directly from Peter Singer, is in fact Peter Singer's view, and which I had attributed to Mill. One utilitarian perspective is that happiness is the only valuable thing, and that leaves us humans as technically not valuable, at least not in ourselves. Human beings would only be valuable as a means to the end of happiness if happiness is in fact the only valuable thing. That is one possible position, and I do believe I could find the very email I received once from Peter Singer on the subject. I'd emailed him and Marvin Olasky after reading something in World Magazine where Olasky had been talking about his discussion with Singer. Never mind the backstory. This is a possible position. I believe it is Peter Singer's position. I've been treating it as Mill's position. The idea that happiness is valuable and that human beings accordingly are not actually valuable except as a means to the end of achieving happiness. Now, I've been thinking this just doesn't make a lot of sense. What good is happiness if the creatures that have happiness are themselves of no value? The value of happiness ought to be understood to be derived from the value of the beings that have happiness. How can happiness be genuinely a valuable thing if human beings who have happiness are not themselves valuable? And Cicero's critique of the Epicureans, where he says we love ourselves, we love happiness because we love ourselves, not vice versa. Cicero's critique is one remark that I think helps to put this in perspective. I still think this is a mistake. I still think it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that happiness is valuable and we are not valuable except as means to happiness. I think the value of happiness derives from the value of the beings that have happiness and not vice versa. So I've been thinking Mill made this mistake. I've been thinking Mill says happiness is the only thing that is truly good. Everything else is only good as a means to the end of happiness. Let me rephrase. I've been thinking Mill was saying happiness is the only thing that is truly good in itself. Everything else is valuable as a means to the end of happiness, including ourselves. And so I've been thinking, well, silly Mill, he's making the same mistake as Peter Singer. He's making the mistake Cicero refuted. He's, or at least objected to. In context, maybe there's refutation, but in my head, all I have is the objection itself. I've been thinking that Mill makes this mistake, and that Mill would do better to recognize the value of human beings, something, of course, Kant does. When Kant says human beings are ends in themselves, Kant is taking the opposite perspective, saying that human beings are valuable. And if there is any value in happiness, obviously it derives from the value of the beings that have happiness. All right, so I've been thinking Mill made this mistake. Let's go to chapter 4 of Utilitarianism. It has already been remarked that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof in the ordinary acceptation of the term. To be incapable of proof by reasoning is common to all first principles, to the first premises of our knowledge, as well as to those of our conduct. But the former, being matters of fact, may be the subject of a direct appeal to the faculties which judge of fact, namely our senses and our internal consciousness. Okay, questions about ultimate ends, questions about ultimate purposes are first principles in ethics, and they correspond to the first principles in our knowledge of the physical world. And the first principles in our knowledge of the physical world can be learned from our sensory faculties. Is there some way of knowing the first principles of morality? In a similar manner, is there a faculty for morality? Can an appeal be made to the same faculties on questions of practical ends, or by what other faculty is cognizance taken of them? And then Mill goes on to explain that desire is that faculty for knowing the first principle of morality, which is that happiness is good. Maybe I should say faculty or something similar to a faculty. That's a subtle question for interpretation of this passage in Mill that does not come into this discussion today. Questions about ends are, in other words, questions what things are desirable. The utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable and the only thing desirable is an end. And then he goes on to explain his view that desire is how we know what is desirable, and we desire happiness, therefore happiness is desirable. And then he spends, well, that only takes him about 3 paragraphs, and he spends the rest of chapter 4 explaining his view that happiness is in fact the only thing we desire. So, does this mean that happiness is the only thing that's good, the only thing that's valuable in itself, and that nothing else is valuable except as a means to happiness, including us? That is how I've been interpreting this book. And I thought, as much as I like this book, that's one point where I disagree with Mill. I think happiness is valuable, but it's not the only thing that's valuable. It's not the only thing that is an end. As Kant says, human beings are ends in themselves, and it's because human beings are valuable that happiness of human beings is also valuable. That's what I've been thinking. But now, let's look at one alternative way we might interpret Mill here. What if when he says ends, he just means states of affairs? He's not talking in the way Kant talks. When Kant says a human being is an end in himself, when Kant says that, human beings are ends in themselves, rational beings are ends in themselves, Kant is talking about what is an ultimate source or an original source or primary source of value, such that if happiness has any value, its value derives from the value of the beings that have happiness. Mill's not talking about that sort of thing. He's not even using the word ends in the same way, according to this alternative interpretation I'm suggesting. What if when Mill says ends, he just means states of affairs? Now, you might actually notice there's perhaps a hint of that in this text. He says, questions, can an appeal be made to the same faculties on questions of practical ends? What is a practical end? He's talking about practical ends specifically. In other words, maybe he's not talking about things that are sources of value, like Kant is talking about when Kant says human beings are ends of themselves. Maybe he's talking about states of affairs we're trying to achieve through our actions. And that's all he means when he says ends. He's not actually disagreeing with Kant. Maybe he agrees, maybe he disagrees, but it doesn't come up here, according to this alternative interpretation I'm suggesting. All he's talking about is states of affairs. When he says happiness is the only end, the only thing desirable as an end, he means a state of affairs with happiness is the only thing desirable as an end. He does not mean happiness is the only thing of any genuine value. Maybe the genuine value of happiness derives from human beings' value, as Kant would have said. Maybe he thinks that. At any rate, he doesn't deny it, is the essential point here. And so my years-long disagreement with Mill is based on a misunderstanding. I don't actually disagree with Mill. Maybe I disagree with Peter Singer, some other utilitarians, but not Mill. Mill's not saying that. That's the alternative interpretation I'm now suggesting. And I've been pondering this interpretation for a while, and now I've concluded, yeah, this looks right. I think this interpretation is correct. Now let's go to the text on the screen here. This is Mill's gigantic logic book. I've got here the convenient Gutenberg edition in PDF. This is his huge book on logic, particularly inductive logic. Now here in chapter, oh, actually, there's lots of chapters for each book of the book. This is one of those books. Augustine's Confessions has 12 books. This is one of those books that, like that, has books within it. We are going to the end of the book, the end of the big book, specifically book 6. And we are looking at chapter 12 of book 6. So let's go back to that in this edition, page 1145. Now look at this remark. The method, therefore, of ethics can be no other than that of art or practice in general. The portion yet uncompleted of the task which we propose to ourselves in the concluding book is to characterize the general method of art as distinguished from science. Ethics is more art than science, and these are technical terms he will elaborate on in this gigantic logic book, particularly in this chapter. The art proposes to itself an end to be attained, defines the end, and hands it over to the science. The science receives it, considers it as a phenomenon or effect to be studied, having investigated its causes and conditions, sends it back to art with a theorem of the combination of circumstances by which it could be produced. We're talking about an end to be attained and an a combination of circumstances by which the end could be produced. Art then examines these combinations of circumstances, and according as any of them are not in human power, pronounces the end attainable or not. The only one of the premises, therefore, which art supplies is the original major premise, which asserts that the attainment of the given end is desirable. He's talking about desirability and ends. Science then lends to art the proposition attained by a series of inductions or deductions that the performance of certain actions will attain the end. Certain actions will attain the end. From these premises, art concludes that the performance of these actions is desirable, and finding it also practicable converts the theorem into rule of precept. Okay, he's talking about, well, how ethics works and how the more philosophical study of ethics relates to science. All of this stuff is terribly interesting, and at this time, I'm not even remotely prepared to comment on it further. I'm only here to comment on this one thing. In this passage, look how he's using the word end, or ends. He's using it to refer to states of affairs that we can achieve, or that we should try to achieve. I think that is much more likely what he means here. If someone like Kant, as any number of people who've been influenced by Kant, me included, I mean, I'm the first person here whom I should mention who made this mistake. Any number of people like Kant or people influenced by Kant might look at Mill saying the only thing desirable as an end is happiness. Happiness is the only end. And might say, no, human beings are ends in themselves, you silly philosopher Mill. And he will disagree with Mill on those grounds. But I think when Mill says ends, he's not talking about the word end in the same way Kant is using it when Kant says human beings are ends in themselves. He's not talking about a source, an original source of value. He's not talking about something which is in itself valuable. No, he's talking about a state of affairs which is in itself valuable. Or at any rate, is to be sought in itself, without reference to any other state of affairs to be sought behind it. Now, maybe, and this is a question for metaethics, a metaphysics of ethics, to consider, maybe the value of a state of affairs in which there's happiness does indeed derive from the value of the beings who in that state of affairs are happy. That would be my view. That would be the Kantian view. And honestly, I hesitate to say anything else about what Mill thinks, unless I should find world enough in time to read all 1,000 pages of this book and other books by Mill. But for our current purposes, I think it should be sufficient to say, in this large logic book by Mill, he refers to ends, and he plainly is talking about states of affairs. So if that Kantian objection were to be made against Mill, as indeed I've made it myself, it would be simply a misunderstanding. Mill's not talking about that. Mill, when he says happiness is an end in itself, is not saying human beings are not. He's saying happiness is the state of affairs we ought to be seeking without reference to any other state of affairs which we can achieve beyond it. Maybe I should clarify that. I like dried mango. So in the current state of affairs, the dried mango is in my office, product of Philippines. The dried mango is in my office. That's the state of affairs we're in. Why is this the state of affairs I have sought? Why did I buy the dried mango and bring it to my office? So that it would be in my office. But why do I seek this state of affairs? So that I can eat the mango at some point. And when I eat the mango, why am I eating the mango? For happiness. The state of affairs, which is the point of all of this, the point of finding the mango in the store, buying it, bringing it to the office, putting it on this shelf up here. The point of all that is so that I may, by eating it, achieve the state of affairs of mango-related happiness. Mill is saying that sort of state of affairs is the sort of state of affairs all our actions are properly seeking. That's the state of affairs all our actions should be seeking. He's not saying the value of happiness does not derive from the value of human beings. If he ever says it, I don't know where he says it. I don't think I any more have any reason to think he says it. When Mill says in Utilitarianism Chapter 4, happiness is the ultimate end, the only ultimate end. He's not saying human beings are not ends in themselves. In the Kantian sense, he's using the word ends in a different sense. He's talking about states of affairs. Happiness is the state of affairs which we should seek. So, anytime on this channel or elsewhere when I have misinterpreted Mill along these lines, sorry, I'll try to do better. in future. But I'll leave the mistakes up on the channel, and I'll see if my brain holds up. I'll make sure this video gets into the right playlist so that it can be used to, so that then the mistake can be used in service of clarifying the truth.